Hi, I'm Laura Johnson, owner of LLEJ Careers, and today I am here with Denise Bittler, owner of Resume Interview Success. We are also co-founders of the Career Experts Group, which is a joint venture of master career professionals and personal branding strategists. Our group shares one mission, and that is to guide and support individuals at all stages of their career journeys, whether they're new college graduates or C-suite executives. So each month we publish an information-packed newsletter called Your Career, Your Future, where we provide the latest in career and hiring trends, insights, tips, and tricks to help you find your next job, climb your career ladder, or make the most out of your current position. Our September newsletter celebrates International Update Your Resume Month. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Arthur Hughes. Arthur is an executive client partner with Heller DeLand Group, specializing in targeted executive search and workforce transition services in the automotive, aerospace, and other manufacturing sectors nationwide. He also provides leadership and career transition training and development assistance to high potential individuals who are seeking to build new skills and move forward in their careers quickly. Arthur also is on the faculty at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. And today, in part one of our two-part series, Arthur answers the top questions on the minds of our readers on applicant tracking systems. So welcome, Arthur, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm really glad to be here.
So welcome, Arthur. We're very excited. ATS is that elusive animal that most people don't understand. A lot of people fear. So we thought we would just run some questions by you, just to give our readers a little bit of knowledge or comfort when it comes to applicant tracking systems. So one of the things, and it drives me nuts, but we keep hearing and seeing published, that is really a misconception, is does ATS reject resumes? I think that's probably the best place to start.
Sure. Yeah, so I guess before we really kind of get into it, an ATS system is an applicant tracking system. So for the lack of a better term, all it really is an electronic filing cabinet. And we'll get into more of the functionality and things of that sort. As an applicant tracking system, it does have a little bit of functionality to reject a person. So there is a tiny bit of truth within that nugget, Denise, that you just mentioned. But generally speaking, ATS systems do not reject applicants. Where I said there is a little bit of truth in that is some companies will set up what they call knockout or screening questions as part of the application process. And if a candidate during that part of the process answers a question that doesn't comply with what they're looking for, a candidate will get automatically rejected in that kind of a process. But it doesn't reject people for other criteria, okay? So it doesn't reject it for skills. It doesn't reject it for, career gaps or anything like that people are often hear, some things that ATS systems do. So if you get a question like, are you authorized to work in the United States? Do you have at least 7 years of experience in a related position, whatever that related position is that you're applying for? That might be a knockout question that you see in the applicant process. And if the job requires 7 years of experience and you answer no to do you have 7 years of experience, well, you'll get knocked out. But generally speaking, that's just a myth that is, kind of popularized on, social media and things like that to, be a little bit of clickbait, to be honest, Denise.
Okay. And just a quick question. So if you are knocked out by the applicant tracking system, my understanding is that happens almost instantaneously. All right. So what I've usually told people is if you apply and you immediately get back a thanks, but no thanks, automated, instantaneously, then there's a very good possibility that it was the applicant tracking system. But if it goes longer than a certain amount of time,
Mhm.
then it's a human made that decision. Is that a right assumption?
Um, Generally, I would say that if you meet the qualifications, or I'm sorry, if there aren't any knockout questions and your resume is immediately rejected, um, two things probably are at play here. One of two things. First of which is there probably is a recruiter that actually got it immediately, took a quick look at it, and decided to disposition you into the reject pile or the reject flag, however you want to consider it. And so you could get something very quickly based on that. In addition to that, one of the things that people don't always realize is that if a job is posted, that doesn't mean it's an active job search all the time. So companies can still have those positions on the job board, but internally it may be closed or on hold or some criteria like that that may spawn that immediate reaction or immediate rejection from the system. So for instance, if they're in the final rounds of interviewing, they may close the job to new applicants. So you could get a rejection based on something like that, perhaps. But most often, if you get a rejection, it's because a person has actually put you into that disposition.
Okay. Especially if you haven't been asked any exclusionary questions.
Correct.
Okay, great. Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting. And so we know that there's more than one ATS system out there, and companies use different systems and companies use them in different ways as well. I suppose it depending on the size of the company and whatnot. So how do companies typically use ATS systems?
Yeah, the answer is it depends. And in fact, most of the questions that you ask from this point forward, well, I'll probably start with some variation of it depends for this very reason, Laura. Companies, first of all, there's literally over 200 companies that actually make some sort of applicant tracking system. And in fact, if a company is very small, Excel might be their applicant tracking system. And the reason the applicant tracking system exists is for certain basic functionality. And a large part of that has to do with just the efficiency of managing the job search process or the recruitment process. In addition to that, a tracking system will actually help HR professionals in terms of compliance. So most organizations have to be very, very careful about equal opportunity. And in order to do that, of course, they have to keep a very robust database of information on candidates that come in so that they can prove that they're hiring people based on qualifications and there's no bias or discrimination involved in that process. So thinking of it again as an electronic filing cabinet, but it's going to make sure that it keeps all the information on the candidates. It's going to be a communication tool, both internally and externally, and it is going to track the status of candidates through a job search process. So it will categorize them depending on the individual company. They'll categorize them in certain categories to know where they are in that process. And lastly, it is a database for candidate search. So not all recruiters will go externally to LinkedIn or a job posting to actually look for candidates. What most often companies will do if they're using their system properly is they will actually use their system as the first search method to try to find qualified candidates. So they'll actually use their own system sort of as an internal LinkedIn, if you will, to be able to search for candidates and their qualifications. And if they've already got that person in the database, they'll reach out to them, if they do meet the qualifications. So the second half of that, though, is how you use the system. And because function out there, first of all, the number of companies, as I said, over 200. But in addition to that, there are variations of each individual software as well. So you can imagine that there are different versions of software, right? So you may have Workday, but you have Workday version 7. Another company may have Workday version 3, right? And not only that, you can, one analogy I heard is quite good. It's like buying a car. You can buy a car and You can get it with all the bells and whistles, or you can get the very basic version and a combination of everything in between. ATS systems are no different. So if you've got Workday version 3 and you've only got one basic module, it may only have very, very basic functionality. Whereas a company like Google may use Workday and they've got all the bells and whistles because they can afford to do that, because they've got literally thousands and thousands of people applying for their jobs every day. So, so really there's, so many different variations out there in how they're used, Laura. There's not a single answer for that question.
Can I, just a question popped into my head, and I'm not sure if you'll know this or not. We hear some recruiters say, I look at every resume or every application that comes in.
Mhm.
And then you look at these jobs and 300, 400, 500 people are applying. And that recruiter probably is also filling 25, 30, 50 positions. I personally find it hard to believe that they're looking at 400 resumes for, every job, but that's just my opinion. So how are they viewing them? Are they using ATS to rank them and looking at them in ranking order? Are they looking at them in the order they came in? And I know there's no one answer, but what are the different ways, I guess, that it could be looked at, or basically not looked at, depending upon when you apply?
Sure. So when applicants apply for positions in an ATS system, they come in and they are basically ranked as they come in, not ranked, but they're basically queued up as they come in. So there's no, there's no specific order that they're put into different categories at that stage for most systems. Now, some systems will do some level of scoring or ranking. However, most recruiters do not rely on that exclusively, because ATS systems are not perfect, right? So we all know that there's so many ways of writing a resume, and we'll get into a little bit about that later on, I'm sure. But the fact that that is well understood by the recruiting community, they want to bring in the best candidate for that hiring manager and for their company. Okay, and even an external recruiter, which I am, we also have the same objective, right? We want to bring the best person in for the company, and we want to do it in a very efficient way. In fact, the better we do that, obviously our performance is just like anybody else's performance in an organization or a third-party company, right? We want to excel in what we do. So if we can deliver, 3 candidates that are just on top, out of this world, we've done our job very well. So
But
as they come in, I'm sorry, Denise.
No, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, so as they come into the system, basically the recruiter has to take a look at it, unless it's missed one of those knockout questions, of course. So
Does it make sense? So is it fair to say that you want to apply as early as possible once a job is posted?
yeah,
Again, just because if they get 300, they may find 10 really good candidates to interview in the first 100.
the answer to that is, it is generally better to be early in the process. There's no doubt about that, because it's not really a numbers game per se, but if the recruiter is actually starting to review applications as the posting, shortly after the posting has been made, it's not unlikely that they may find 10 or 15 perfectly qualified candidates within the first, maybe the first week that the job has been posted, right?
Right.
And they will start moving forward. It's in everybody's best interest to fill this job as fast as possible with the best possible person. So if they've got qualified candidates coming through the pipeline, they will actually review those candidates much more closely if they meet the basic qualifications. And those people will then be moved to the hiring manager. So if you're on week 2 or week 3 of the process, your resume will probably be looked at, but unless you're an obvious superstar relative to the people who have been submitted previous to that, it's not likely you'll get a look unless other people in that earlier phase start dropping out for whatever reason.
Okay, got it. Got it. Thank you. That actually, that helps really clarify that.
Sure.
Thank you.
So along with what the ATSs read and that kind of thing, I've heard you have to use certain kinds of titles for each section, and that some titles won't be read by ATS. For example, core competencies, using that as a title, section title instead of skills.
Mhm.
Is that the case?
Not generally. I think most systems are capable of understanding different headers for different key sections. And the reason for that is the prevalence of people using some of these. Now, I wouldn't get too cute with your headers. So, you may not want to put in my story, right? Instead of, the experience section, just to try to be, you can go a little too far with standing out and differentiating yourself. You can do that for the wrong reasons, right? As long as you're using fairly standard categories and you're grouping them together with information, with common information, most ATS systems will be able to kind of figure out what it is. But as I said, as long, it's just trying to stick to a fairly standard script, and you should be good in almost all instances.
Great.
So kind of along that same line a little bit, I have a bunch of certifications that I'm very proud of. And, for the human reader with the resume, yes, I'm going to have a certification section, but that's usually toward the end of the second page. So I have my name, comma, and then the certification acronyms. Does that cause a problem with ATS?
I love how you said that. You have your name followed by a comma.
Yes.
If you do that, most ATS systems will not have a problem figuring out that that's not part of your name.
Really? Okay.
So now, having said that, I don't know every ATS system, so I don't know if some systems might cough up along with that, to be fair. But I think the biggest thing that you want to consider is that certification something that is a requirement for the position or a preferred designation for the position?
Does it help you stand out?
Yeah, if it's a qualification that really doesn't apply, I would very much suggest that not be included in your name. But I think, and also if it's not something that is unusual or unique. So, for instance, I wouldn't recommend putting MBA after your name necessarily, as an example, because let's be honest, MBA is fairly prevalent out there. It doesn't make you unique anymore like it used to. So use them, let's say, in specific instances where it really does help you stand out, or it does is part of the qualifications of the job. Otherwise, you can include it in prominent places. You can put it in your summary, for instance. You could put it in your core qualifications or your skills, as well as listing it down in there. And with the certification section, perhaps. So different strategies depending on the unique situation that you're looking at. But generally speaking, I would say the credentials are okay as long as you make sure they're delineated with a comma.
Great.
Yeah, that's good to know. I'm going to start to do that with some of my CPAs and people like that.
Sure.
I've also heard hyperlinks like email addresses, LinkedIn URLs, people with personal portfolios and GitHub kinds of links, that hyperlinks confuse or mess up ATS. Does that actually cause a problem?
Not that I'm aware of, to be honest. What we see typically is those kinds of things, again, are fairly standard now in resumes. So most of the systems have, as long as the companies are keeping regularly up with updates and things of that sort, most of that functionality will handle those, hyperlinks without any problem at all. You may find some unique situations, maybe where an older system, may have some limitations, but I wouldn't say that it's going to ever be a real problem.
So,
And in fact, most people prefer them because they want to download it and they want to actually click on that link to take them there. They don't want to be retyping.
So the ATS system will parse that as a hyperlink and,
No, it will not
Oh, okay.
parse it as a hyperlink. In fact, I'm not exactly sure how it's going to specifically handle it in the system. For
Okay.
our system, it doesn't pull it out as anything that is usable. I can't, but I can't speak for all systems in that particular.
I've seen it on some where it'll just pull it through as straight text.
Yes,
So
that's
it
what ours
takes it,
does.
it reads it, it just doesn't, it doesn't parse it as a hyperlink, it parses it as straight text.
Correct. That's what ours does.
Okay, yeah.
But it
But
doesn't
might
cause a
send it as
problem.
hyperlink with, especially if you're gonna also have a PDF, so that if a recruiter downloads it, if they email it to somebody or whatever, especially with the LinkedIn link, because if you have a fairly common name, you don't want them spending 15 minutes trying to figure out which one's you on LinkedIn.
No, that's a very good point, Denise. But as I said, I don't, I can't see any situation where it's a real problem, with the exception of maybe the real oddball out there.
Okay. So you mentioned earlier, we talked about, I always called them the drop dead things. You called them required. But knockout. So, 10 years of experience in technology field and 5 years of experience in leadership.
Mhm.
Way back when, I have a recollection, and I could be wrong, that some of the applicant tracking systems actually calculated this and made the decision. And a lot of companies realized that no matter how good of an ATS, it just wasn't good at it. So they moved more to asking you, do you have? Is that a fair statement or assumption that usually now it's them asking a question versus the ATS determining or calculating those requirement questions?
Generally speaking, yes. Here's the thing, Denise, to your point earlier about, do recruiters read every single resume? Well, it depends on what you define the word read as. But here's the reality, there for jobs, you may have 200 or maybe even more applicants for a certain position, right? So in order to make the job easier for myself, we're going to put in some knockout questions. So that will limit the amount of resumes that I have to read. Okay. And so we may scan the resumes that are rejected just to make sure that the ATS system, or, sometimes maybe people don't read the question properly. And, so they, a lot of times those resumes still actually get read if there's time. And we can argue whether there isn't time, is there not time. But regardless of that, here's what we're considering. We want the knockout questions to make our job easier and to help us find that ideal candidate faster. So if my requirement is a drop dead, I'm going to put that as a knockout question. So if it's the 10 years of experience, if it's a BS degree, if it's obviously the authorization to work in the US or need for a sponsorship, those are going to be the typical questions that you see in knockout, because a recruiter or a company says, you know what, if you don't have that, I really don't want to see you for this position. Okay. So that's will help a recruiter in terms of manage their workload. And that way they only have to review maybe 75 resumes out of that 200 instead of all 200. Does that help?
Yeah, that absolutely helps.
Let me make a point though, because you talked about scoring, and you're right in the fact that some systems will look for a skill or a tool within a experience to be able to then try to calculate the number of years of experience you have. But you made the point when you said to yourself, the ATS system, regardless of how good it is not going to be very good at being able to try to figure out, well, really, do you have 10 years or 20 years or 2 years of experience?
And how much was management and how much was this? And
Yeah. You could have been a manager for the last 10 years and, your people all use the tool, but you don't use it on a daily basis, right? That was my, we had an ERP system at the last place where I was vice president of purchasing. And I could not have gotten into the ERP system, but everybody else in my team was using it, right? So yeah, that's exactly the point. So in order to combat that, making that mistake, or not having, so that you bring in somebody that may not have the qualifications, that simple question is the easiest way to approach it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it does. It does. So when you talk about knockout information, we've been kicking this back and forth. I feel like for a few years now, what is required as an address? Do we need our full address, including the physical location, versus city state versus zip code? And if people want to relocate, what should they be using or including as an address for the
Yeah, this
ATS?
has been getting a lot of play lately, and I've been thinking about that as well. I've got a candidate that I actually am working with as a coach who's in Mexico today, and he wants to relocate, and we were just talking about that very point. Um, Again, the ATS system is just a database of information. So it's going to be pulling in information, and it's going to pull in your location if you have the location. It's absolutely not necessary to include your street address. That's not important. Having the city where you are located is expected. And in some cases, if you don't have it in the ATS system, it can't see it. You may have to go through the application process, and you may see that location is a required field and there's nothing in there because the ATS couldn't find where you were located. So you may have to physically put that in because the ATS system couldn't get it. So it's important for you to know that it's going to depend on the role, the company, lots of different variables as to whether or not that may be important to your candidacy for the position. Most companies are risk adverse and they're cost conscious. So they don't want to pay for relocation if they can avoid it. So they will, those companies that feel that way will prioritize location. So you may be put on a maybe list if you are, let's just say you're in a large metro community. And like Detroit, and you're on the south end of Detroit, and the applicants on the north end of Detroit, and it's about an hour and 20-minute one-way commute to get through Detroit traffic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Would you select that person necessarily as one of your top 3 candidates if you've got a pool of equally qualified people? Probably not, right? So it could mean something on whether or not you get through the system, but let's make the distinction here that the ATS system is not making that decision. That's going to be a person that's going to be looking at your requirements.
Okay.
So here's the rub, right? Because you now know that, I'll use the word game the system a little bit. And if you are willing to relocate, you could put the community that you want to relocate to, assuming it's close to the job that you're applying for, or you can actually put your location as to the place where you're applying. And then you can cross that bridge later on. I'm not saying you lie per se, but the fact that you're willing to, particularly if you're willing to take on the expense yourself to relocate, I think it's perfectly fine to do it as long as you're transparent through the process. When you finally speak to somebody at that organization, you let them know that, maybe not proactively necessarily, but you certainly let them know if asked that, yeah, I happen to live in, I'm working in Mexico right now, but I plan on moving to wherever my next job is because that's important to me, right? So, I think there are ways of playing around with that, Laura, that, you just need to be smart about that if you're really serious about the position.
Zip code, no zip code.
A zip code, I would say no. It used to be that they're a little bit more required. You don't need zip code. Zip code may bring that commute question into play
Right.
sometimes, but I don't think zip code is necessary. Again, unless the applicant tracking system or the application that you are required to fill out for that role, if that calls for it, you may be asked for it, but it does not necessarily have to be on your resume.
But if you didn't put it in and it requires it, it wouldn't it wouldn't reject your application. It would ask for it or let it go through without it. One, like, kind of one or the other.
I would say that is going to be likely in almost all cases, yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, I think a company doesn't want to have a tool that's going to automatically eliminate someone for that kind of data being
Got it.
missing. So as I said, if it somehow does get rejected, like I said, it is typical that recruiters will review those resumes. They'll just quickly scan them to see if there might have been something that was, that caused it to be kicked out. But the other thing too is you have to remember that the resume itself will probably not be reviewed by a recruiter, the actual physical document, unless they kind of get to the next step.
Mhm.
So they'll use their ATS system to evaluate the candidates and their experience and their skills and the tools that they need. They'll use their ATS system to look at candidates that way and the information that's been parsed into the system. And they may not actually physically read the resume, meaning the PDF document or the Word document, until later on in the process. So they're reading the resume, they're reading the content, but usually it's in the ATS system, if that distinction is clear.
Yes, and that actually, for our, this is a multi-part series, and for the second part of the series, that is going to be a big focus.
Okay.
In, reading versus parsing versus visible. So for those of you who are watching this, make sure that you check out the second, our second interview with Arthur. So,
Good enough.
All right, Laura, did you have any last questions for Arthur or?
I work with a lot of people who have who use abbreviations for things because it's their lingo,
Sure.
and so they don't fully spell things out. And I tend to, in my resumes, spell it out once, and then in parentheses use the
Acronym.
abbreviation, and then refer to the abbreviation for the rest of the resume. Just spell it out once. How do you feel about that? Should these be spelled out all the time? Can we use parentheses?
Yes, and your advice is pretty sound. The only exception to that are some really common abbreviations. Like for instance, if you're talking about an MBA, most of the time it's not necessary to necessarily define that, although it just makes good sense in the education section that you would define that there, or write it out as opposed to just abbreviate that. But it always is good practice to spell it out first in the first instance that it's used, and use the acronym in parentheses as you described, Laura. The reason for that is we talked about the system being a search tool.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're in the system and maybe you're not even applying for a job in that company, that current job in the company, maybe you applied 6 weeks ago and you were rejected for that role, you're now in their system. And if you're a good candidate, maybe you qualify better for another particular role that they have, they're going to go into their system and they're going to do typically a Boolean search, right? And they're going to look for certain things. Now, here's where the ATS system is not at fault. It's actually human error. If the recruiter doesn't actually put in the right search string, maybe they type out the word the phrase instead of using the common acronym, it may be that it gets missed if you don't have both of those things in the resume. So if they use the acronym but not the spelling it out, and somebody says, well, you know what, I'm going to spell it out every time and not use the acronym, they could hurt themselves. So make sure you include both instances at least once, right? So in your example, that's perfect. And that way you don't have to rely on the recruiter putting in both of those. Sometimes we try to be very diligent so that we don't miss someone. So most recruiters will do the right thing, but we're always flying through, sometimes we take shortcuts, sometimes we're busy and distracted, and we may not put the right string in there. So that advice is sound.
So Arthur, we've really covered a lot of information here. And, so much of life right now is being impacted by AI and, the whole hiring process, applicant tracking systems, that's not immune to any of this. And every day you read something new. So, do you have any kind of thoughts, reminders, or caveats that you want to add about anything that we've discussed today?
Yeah, I certainly do. I think what we don't know is what we don't know. So what we really understand now is, right, November, ChatGPT launched. Since then, the world has been kind of flipped on its head. That's also you're starting to see a little bit of play in that in these ATS systems as well. And what you're going to see is going to be, or what you are seeing now, is a race to integrate AI into the ATS systems. Now, the problem with that for companies and perhaps for candidates as well is we have no idea when that'll be integrated into products that are actually being used by companies. Even though something may be rolled out today by one of the providers, that doesn't mean that it's immediately available to everybody that's using that product.
That's true.
Right? So it's probably going to be an upgrade. It may be a new implementation, right? They've got to train people how to use it. So it's not going to be something that they can just
And there's
flip
going
a
to be
switch.
cost, I would assume.
Of course there will be,
Mm.
right? Yeah, nobody's going to just give this away. Of course not. So all of those things are going to be in play. So will we really see something substantive perhaps in the next few months? I would say probably not. That's going to really make a meaningful difference to our previous conversation points that we've had today, Denise. But I think the reality is that things are going to continue to change. The answers that we've given today may not really be accurate tomorrow. I can tell you that it's very much understood that formatting is not going to be important in the future. The AI system is going to be able to be smart enough to pull the information out, regardless of whether it's in a text box, a graph. Some things will still not necessarily be relevant from a context perspective because it won't be able to understand the context of the particular item that we're talking about. But a lot of the things we talk about that you shouldn't do may be completely, a non-issue in the future, and I would say that's likely to be the case. So I think that formatting is perhaps going to be a little less important for us, but the things that career coaches, resume writers, those types of professionals can really add value in is making sure that the resume, from a context point of view, delivers a very strong value statement for the candidate. And the ATS system will be an afterthought at a certain point, in my opinion. But we'll see. It's a little too early to tell, and we're all just kind of operating on what we think.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure.
I thought I knew a decent amount. You dissuaded me of that that idea. I feel like I've learned a lot, and hopefully our viewers and our readers will really come away with a really good comfort level.
Excellent. Yeah,
Yeah,
glad
this
I
has
can help. Yeah.
been informative as always, and I'm looking forward to part 2.
Yes.
So for the people for our audience, if you want to learn more about Career Experts Group, you can go to our website, and that is at www.careerexpertsgroup.com. You can also go there to access current and past issues or subscribe to Your Career, Your Future, our newsletter. And that is www.careerexpertsgroup.com/newsletter-sign-up. So watch for part 2 in our series to come in November when we celebrate National Career Development Month. So thanks again, Arthur, and thanks for everybody else. Thanks, Denise, and thanks for everybody else for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you, Arthur.
Thanks. It's been great.